I still remember how quiet the room went after he said it. "You've crossed the line," my husband said, right there at our own dinner table, his voice calm, almost bored. Then he added, as if he were talking about the weather, "It's not a big deal." The words didn't sound loud, but they landed heavy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. That was the part that hurt the most. Around us, plates froze midair. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Someone shifted in their chair. Another person cleared their throat and then looked down at their lap. No one spoke. No one corrected him. No one asked what he meant or why he thought it was acceptable to say that to his wife in front of everyone. I realized then that the silence wasn't awkwardness. It was agreement by avoidance. I didn't argue. I didn't explain myself. I didn't ask him to clarify something he had clearly rehearsed in his own mind. I stayed seated for a few seconds longer than felt natural. I folded my napkin carefully, the way my mother taught me, and placed it beside my plate. I pushed my chair back and stood up. No one stopped me. As I walked away from that table, I didn't know yet what I would lose. I only knew I was done losing myself. The dinner was at our house. That detail matters more than it might sound. I had spent the entire day preparing, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, arranging food no one would remember, making sure everything looked effortless. I had wanted the night to feel warm, easy, respectable, the kind of dinner people later describe as lovely. I was 42 years old, living in a quiet suburb outside Philadelphia, married to Daniel for just over 7 years. From the outside, our life looked settled. Good jobs, a comfortable home, no public fights, no scandals anyone could point to. If someone had asked our guests that night whether anything was wrong in our marriage, most of them would have laughed and said no. That was the problem. Nothing ever looked wrong. The question I asked at the table hadn't been sharp or accusatory. It wasn't about betrayal or suspicion. It was about a promise Daniel had made and quietly broken. One of many small ones I had learned to raise gently, like fragile objects that might shatter if handled the wrong way. I asked it calmly, with a half smile, giving him room to answer without embarrassment. Instead, he decided to correct me. Not privately, not later. Right there, in front of people who smiled at us over wine glasses and polite conversation. He reduced me to someone who had overstepped an invisible boundary only he was allowed to define. When I left the table, I didn't storm off. I walked down the hallway to our bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. I remember staring at my hands and noticing how steady they were. That surprised me. I had expected shaking, heat, something dramatic. Instead, I felt cold clarity settle in. That moment didn't come out of nowhere. It only felt sudden because I had spent so long ignoring the slow buildup that led there. For years, I had told myself our marriage was just entering a quieter phase. That distance was normal. That routines replaced excitement if you stayed long enough. Daniel liked to say we were past the dramatic years, and I had taken that as a compliment, as proof of maturity. He worked long hours. I adjusted. He forgot things that mattered to me. I reminded myself not to keep score. When conversations grew shorter, more transactional, I told myself not every marriage needed deep talks to survive. I became very good at minimizing my own discomfort. Friends would comment on how calm we were together, how stable. I nodded along, because stability sounds like safety when you're afraid to ask for more. I learned to phrase concerns carefully, to soften questions before they were spoken. Over time, I started editing myself without realizing it, trimming away anything that might irritate or inconvenience him. The night of the dinner forced me to see what that editing had cost. When Daniel followed me into the hallway later, his voice was already defensive. He told me I was being sensitive, that I had embarrassed him by walking away, that everyone would think something was wrong now. I looked at him and realized how backwards that logic was. He had humiliated me publicly, but my refusal to accept it was the real offense. I didn't argue then either. I told him I needed space and closed the door again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to smooth things over before going to sleep. Lying there in the quiet, I understood something that would take me months to fully accept. That sentence at the table wasn't a mistake. It was a test. And for the first time, I hadn't passed it the way he expected. That dinner wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the moment I stopped protecting it at my own expense. From the outside, our marriage looked like the kind people admired quietly. Daniel and I were the couple others pointed to when conversations turned to stability. We didn't fight in public. We didn't post passive-aggressive messages or storm out of restaurants. We showed up on time, sent thank you notes, hosted dinners, remembered birthdays. People assumed that meant we were happy. I assumed it too. For longer than I care to admit, we met in our mid-30s, both a little tired of drama, both convinced that calm was the same thing as compatibility. In the early years, our life felt balanced. We divided responsibilities naturally. We talked about the future in practical terms. There was comfort in knowing what to expect from each other. I told myself that was love maturing. There were no slammed doors, no explosive arguments. Disagreements were handled with careful language. Or more often, not handled at all. If something bothered me, I found a way to phrase it gently or postponed it until it felt less important. Daniel appreciated that I was easy, a word he used like praise. I wore it proudly at first. Over time, I noticed I was the one doing most of the adjusting. If his work ran late, I reheated dinner. If he forgot a plan we had made, I told myself it wasn't intentional. When he stopped asking questions about my day, I filled the silence with updates he half listened to, nodding while checking his phone. I learned the exact length of a pause before it became uncomfortable and stepped in before it ever did. What I didn't do was ask why I was the only one trying to keep things smooth. I remember the moment I realized our conversations had become functional rather than personal. We talked about schedules, bills, logistics. We rarely talked about feelings unless they were his. And even then, briefly, when I brought up something that made me uneasy, he'd respond with solutions instead of curiosity, as if emotion itself were an inconvenience to be managed. He wasn't cruel. That made it harder. Cruelty would have given me something solid to push against. Instead, there was a constant low-level dismissal that was easy to excuse and difficult to name. He never told me my feelings didn't matter. He just acted as though they were optional. I started noticing how often I second-guessed myself. If I felt lonely sitting next to him on the couch, I wondered if I was being dramatic. If I missed how we used to talk, I reminded myself that long marriages weren't built on constant connection. I compared myself to other women and concluded I was lucky. That comparison kept me quiet. Daniel began spending more time away from home, always with a reasonable explanation. Work projects, networking events, last-minute meetings. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't even suspect him. Not at first. I told myself ambition required sacrifice, and that being supportive meant not asking too many questions. Still, something shifted in the way he looked at me. Or rather, the way he didn't. Eye contact shortened. Affection became habitual instead of spontaneous. When I reached for him, it felt like interrupting something more important. I told myself every marriage goes through seasons. The truth is, I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped being agreeable. I had seen how women were labeled when they asked for too much, when they expressed dissatisfaction without a dramatic reason. I didn't want to be seen as ungrateful or insecure. I had worked hard to build a life that looked respectable, and I wasn't ready to risk that image. So I stayed quiet. I smoothed over moments that should have been addressed. I accepted emotional distance as maturity. I mistook endurance for strength. The dinner table moment didn't humiliate me because it was public. It humiliated me because it revealed how little space I had left in my own marriage. Daniel felt comfortable correcting me in front of others because he had been doing it in smaller ways for years, behind closed doors, without resistance. That night, sitting alone in our bedroom, I replayed moments I had brushed aside, times I had stopped myself from speaking, conversations I had edited before they ever happened. I realized how often I had chosen peace over honesty, not realizing I was slowly losing both. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. There was no affair to point to, no undeniable betrayal I could name. Just a growing sense that I was shrinking to fit a version of marriage that required less and less of me. I fell asleep knowing something had shifted. Not between Daniel and me, but inside myself. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped explaining his behavior away. I didn't know it yet, but the signs I had been ignoring were already lining up, waiting for me to finally look at them. I didn't go looking for proof. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't scrolling through his phone in the shower or tracking his location out of suspicion. I still believed, at least then, that marriages deserved the benefit of the doubt. But once something inside you shifts, you start noticing things you used to dismiss without effort. The first thing I noticed was money. It wasn't a large amount at first. Just unfamiliar charges mixed in with the ordinary ones. Dinners that didn't line up with nights he said he'd worked late. A hotel charge during a week he claimed he'd stayed with a colleague after a conference ran long. Each time, there was a reasonable explanation ready before I even asked. Client meetings, work obligations, networking. I told myself successful people ate expensive dinners. Then his routines changed. Daniel had always been predictable, almost proudly so. Suddenly he wasn't. He started leaving earlier, coming home later, his schedule full of last-minute adjustments. He bought new clothes without mentioning it, joined a gym across town instead of the one near our house, and became oddly protective of his calendar. When I asked about his day, the answers grew vague, efficient, as if details were unnecessary. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, watching him talk animatedly into his phone, his voice lighter than it had been with me in months. When he noticed me, he turned away slightly and lowered his tone. After he hung up, he said it was work and changed the subject. I let him. At social events, things felt subtly off, not enough to point to, but enough to linger. There was a woman I had seen around before, someone connected to his professional circle. I won't pretend I noticed her immediately. It was the way Daniel interacted with her that caught my attention. Too familiar. Too comfortable. Shared jokes that didn't include anyone else. A glance held a beat too long before he looked away. When I asked how he knew her, he answered easily, confidently. They worked together sometimes. Nothing unusual. I nodded and moved on, annoyed at myself for feeling unsettled. The most unsettling part wasn't what I saw. It was what I felt afterward. I started replaying conversations in my head, analyzing tone and timing in ways I never had before. I questioned whether I was imagining distance that wasn't there. I told myself not to become the kind of woman who saw threats everywhere. I prided myself on being rational, grounded, fair. That pride kept me quiet. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I came across a receipt that made my stomach drop. Not because it was explicit, but because it removed the last layer of plausible denial. The date, the time, the location. I knew where he had said he was that night. I knew he hadn't been there. I sat at the dining table for a long time, the paper resting between my hands, feeling something close to numbness. It wasn't anger yet. It was the strange calm that arrives when a question finally answers itself. Still, I didn't confront him. That choice surprises people when I tell this story. They ask why I didn't demand the truth immediately, why I didn't call him out. The answer is simple and complicated at the same time. I understood, instinctively, that once I spoke, the dynamic would change. Accusations would trigger defenses. Truth would become negotiable. Silence, for the moment, gave me clarity. I started paying attention instead of explaining things away. I listened more carefully, noticed patterns, trusted the discomfort I had been overriding for years. I saw how often he corrected me casually, how easily he dismissed concerns that required empathy instead of logic. I noticed how little room there was for me unless I made myself small. The night suspicion turned into certainty wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation. It was an overheard sentence, spoken without care, that confirmed everything I already knew. He didn't realize I could hear him. He didn't realize how much that one moment would cost him. I went to bed that night, knowing I would never unknow what I knew. Strangely, I slept well. The next morning, I looked at him across the breakfast table and felt nothing I could name as love. I didn't feel hatred either. Just distance. A clean, unmistakable separation between who I had been trying to be and who I was becoming. I understood then that silence was no longer neutral. It was either protection or permission. And I had spent too many years giving permission without realizing it. Whatever came next wouldn't be gentle. Not because I planned to be cruel, but because truth has a way of forcing decisions whether you're ready for them or not. I didn't know when the moment would come. I only knew it was no longer something I could avoid. The night everything shifted didn't begin with a fight. It began with waiting. I was alone in the living room, the house dim except for a single lamp, the kind of quiet that feels intentional rather than peaceful. Daniel had said he'd be late again. I hadn't asked why. I hadn't reminded him what he'd promised earlier that week. By then, I had learned that asking only delayed the inevitable. My phone was face down on the coffee table. I remember noticing the time on the clock, just after 11, and feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching my own life from a distance. When the message came, it wasn't dramatic. Need you to do something for me. Now, no greeting, no explanation, just expectation. A second message followed before I had time to respond, spelling it out more clearly. He needed me to cover for him, to make a call, send an email, smooth over a situation that, once again, he had created and assumed I would quietly resolve. The tone wasn't apologetic. It was efficient, almost annoyed, as if my hesitation were already an inconvenience. Reading it, I felt something click into place. This wasn't secrecy. It was entitlement. He wasn't asking for help. He was assuming my compliance. And in that assumption, I saw the full shape of our marriage laid bare. Not partnership. Not respect. Management. I set the phone down and waited. Another message arrived. Sharper this time. He reminded me of what would happen if I didn't cooperate. Not a threat exactly, but close enough to make his expectation unmistakable. He believed I would choose damage control over discomfort, as I always had. For the first time, my body didn't react with anxiety. There was no racing heart, no tightness in my chest. I felt steady, calm in a way that startled me. I realized, with unexpected clarity, that whatever he was asking me to protect was already beyond saving. I typed my response carefully, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. When I finally replied, it was short and factual. I told him I wouldn't be doing what he asked. I didn't explain why. I didn't justify myself. I didn't soften the refusal. The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. His reply came quickly, irritated and dismissive. He accused me of overreacting, of choosing the worst possible moment to make a point. He reminded me of how much was at stake, as if I hadn't been carrying that weight for years. That was when I did something I hadn't planned, but somehow knew I needed to do. Earlier that week, after one too many inconsistencies, I had taken a step I hadn't told anyone about. I had scheduled a quiet consultation, framed as a general inquiry, with a professional resource connected to my own workplace. Nothing dramatic, just questions, hypotheticals. What happens when conflicts of interest aren't disclosed? How accountability works when personal relationships blur professional boundaries. At the time, it felt like information gathering, a way to ground myself in facts instead of fear. That night, it became something else. I didn't confront Daniel with what I knew. I didn't tell him what I was about to do. I simply followed through on the guidance I had been given. I documented what I could verify. Dates, communications, transactions that raised legitimate concerns. I submitted them through the proper channel, without commentary or accusation, trusting the process to do what it was designed to do. When I finished, I felt no rush of satisfaction, only resolve. His messages grew frantic as the minutes passed. He asked where I was, why I wasn't responding the way I usually did. When I finally told him I was going to bed, he sent one last message, heavy with implication, warning me that I was making a mistake. I turned the phone off. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle. I thought about how many nights I had spent worrying about his stress, his image, his future. How rarely I had worried about my own. For years, I had believed that being supportive meant absorbing impact quietly. That love required flexibility, even when it bent you out of shape. That staying calm was the same as being strong. That night taught me the difference. By morning, the situation had moved beyond private negotiation. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold, only that they would. Systems. Once engaged, don't pause for personal discomfort. They ask questions. They follow procedures. They remove the illusion of control from people who rely on silence to maintain it. When Daniel came home the next day, exhausted and defensive, he tried to act as though nothing had changed. He talked too much, laughed at things that weren't funny, avoided my eyes. I watched him with a detachment that surprised us both. He asked if we were okay. I told him I didn't know yet. That was the last time I offered uncertainty as a cushion. The truth was, the marriage had already ended the night he assumed my loyalty was guaranteed. Everything that followed was just consequence catching up to choice. I went about my day with deliberate normalcy, answering emails, returning calls, making dinner for myself alone, somewhere beyond our walls. Processes were beginning that neither of us could stop. I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to what he demanded. I was responding to what I knew. And nothing after that night would ever belong solely to the two of us again. Consequences don't arrive all at once. They seep in, quietly at first. Like water finding cracks you didn't know were there. The morning after that night, Daniel moved through the house with a nervous energy I had never seen before. He talked too fast, filled silences that didn't need filling, checked his phone constantly. He asked ordinary questions in a tone that suggested he was bracing for something extraordinary. I answered calmly, without offering reassurance. By mid-morning, his confidence had started to fray. He called me twice while I was at work, then sent a message asking if we could reset and talk later. Not apologize. Reset. As if the problem were a temporary glitch rather than a structural failure. I didn't respond. For the first time, silence wasn't avoidance. It was accuracy. By the end of the day, the cracks had spread beyond our house. A colleague stopped by my office under the pretense of small talk and asked a question that felt carefully rehearsed. It wasn't accusatory. It was cautious, neutral. The kind of inquiry people make when they're trying to understand the scope of a situation without tipping their hand. I answered truthfully, without embellishment, and watched the understanding settle across their face. That was when I realized this was no longer private. Daniel came home late again, this time without the casual explanations he used to rely on. He hovered near me in the kitchen, pretending to look for something in the refrigerator, then finally asked what I had told people. The question was sharp, edged with panic. I told him I had told the truth. That answer didn't satisfy him. He wanted details, damage control, a chance to manage the narrative the way he always had. When I didn't provide it, his frustration tipped into anger. He accused me of overreacting, of blowing things out of proportion, of risking everything over something that could have been handled internally. Internally. The word stuck with me. For years, internally had meant quietly. It had meant me carrying discomfort so he wouldn't have to. It had meant protecting his image at the expense of my own clarity. Hearing him say it again, now, sounded hollow. The next few days blurred together in a series of small, unmistakable shifts. His phone rang more often, and he stepped outside to answer it. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were rescheduled. He began coming home earlier, not out of concern, but out of necessity. The illusion of control he had relied on was eroding, and he could feel it. So could everyone else. Friends who used to invite us as a unit began reaching out to me individually. Conversations that once felt easy now carried an undercurrent of awareness. No one asked direct questions. But the pauses were longer, the listening more attentive. I didn't volunteer information. I didn't need to. The story was unfolding without my narration. Daniel tried a different approach then. He softened. He apologized in vague terms, careful not to admit anything concrete. He spoke about stress, misunderstandings, timing. He told me he felt betrayed by my lack of loyalty, as if loyalty were owed regardless of circumstance. I listened, unmoved. Watching him scramble was unsettling. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it exposed how much he had underestimated me. He had believed my calm meant compliance, that my patience was infinite. He hadn't considered what would happen if I stopped buffering the impact of his choices. By the end of the week, the professional consequences could no longer be ignored. A formal inquiry was underway. Procedures were being followed. Questions were being asked that couldn't be deflected with charm or confidence. Daniel stopped pretending nothing was wrong. That was when he panicked. He asked me to help him explain things, to vouch for him, to contextualize his behavior. He framed it as protecting our future, as if our futures were still intertwined. I told him I wouldn't be doing that. The look on his face then wasn't anger. It was fear, for the first time. He understood that I was no longer standing between him and the consequences of his actions. I wasn't pushing him forward or pulling him back. I had stepped aside. That realization broke something in him. He cycled through emotions quickly after that. Anger, bargaining, self-pity. He accused me of ruining his life, then begged me to help him fix it. Each attempt was more frantic than the last, as if intensity might substitute for accountability. I remained steady. What surprised me most was how little I felt compelled to explain myself. I had spent years justifying my feelings, softening my needs, making sure others were comfortable. Now, clarity required no defense. The truth didn't need my protection. The social shift was quieter but just as profound. People began to look at me differently, with a mix of sympathy and respect that made me uncomfortable at first. I wasn't used to being believed without having to perform for it. I wasn't used to my restraint being read as strength rather than passivity. Daniel noticed that too. He made one last attempt to control the narrative at a small gathering we attended separately. He spoke loudly, laughed too hard, tried to project normalcy. It didn't work. The room felt strained, and he knew it. He left early, citing a headache. I stayed. Driving home that night, alone, I felt a strange sense of inevitability. The dominoes were falling exactly as they needed to, not because I had pushed them, but because I had finally stopped holding them upright. I understood then that the hardest part was over, not because the consequences had fully landed, but because I was no longer afraid of them. What came next would involve paperwork, logistics, decisions that would reshape my life. There would be losses, adjustments, moments of grief I hadn't reached yet. But the chaos phase was ending. The truth was out, moving on its own momentum, and I didn't need to chase it or contain it. For the first time in years, I felt aligned with myself, and I knew that whatever followed would be built on something solid, not silence. Silence gave me room to think. While everything around Daniel grew louder and more chaotic, my days became oddly structured. I woke up at the same time, went to work, answered emails, ate lunch at my desk. On the surface, nothing about my routine changed. Underneath it, everything did. I stopped reacting. That decision alone felt radical. For years, my instinct had been to respond immediately, to smooth, to clarify, to make things easier for both of us. Now I let messages sit unanswered. I listened without interrupting. I allowed conversations to end without resolution. It wasn't punishment. It was distance, carefully maintained. I understood something then that I wish I had learned earlier. Confrontation gives the other person time to prepare. Silence lets you prepare instead. I sought advice quietly, without drama or declarations, not to plot revenge, but to understand reality. I asked practical questions. How shared assets were viewed? What documentation mattered? Where assumptions I had made over the years didn't hold up under scrutiny. Each answer sharpened my focus. One fact, in particular, changed everything. I learned that the protections I thought existed simply because we were married did not automatically apply. That certain decisions made in trust carried consequences I hadn't considered. It wasn't frightening. It was clarifying. Fear comes from uncertainty. Knowledge, even when uncomfortable, brings options, so I gathered information. Not obsessively, methodically. Bank statements, records of communication, timelines that aligned behavior with outcomes. I wasn't looking to prove betrayal in an emotional sense. I was establishing patterns, consistency, cause and effect. The process was strangely grounding. Each document felt like a piece of solid ground under my feet. I didn't tell Daniel what I was doing. He interpreted my calm as weakness. He mistook my lack of reaction for exhaustion, maybe even guilt. He spoke more confidently again, assuming the storm had passed. He made plans, talked about the future, suggested trips and resets and fresh starts. I listened and said very little. At home, I made small changes that went unnoticed at first. Passwords updated, personal files organized, a separate account opened quietly. Not as a dramatic gesture, but as a boundary. I began thinking of the house not as shared territory, but as a place I needed to feel safe. Safety, I learned, is not just physical. It's informational, emotional, financial. The more I prepared, the calmer I became. Not numb, focused. I wasn't suppressing emotion. I was placing it where it belonged. Out of the decision-making process. Grief could come later. Right now. Clarity mattered. Daniel noticed the shift eventually. He asked why I seemed distant, why I wasn't engaging the way I used to. He joked about me being mysterious, then accused me of shutting him out. I didn't deny it. I told him I was taking care of myself. The phrase irritated him. It didn't fit into the narrative he preferred, where care was something I provided, not something I claimed. There was a moment, late one evening, when he said something that revealed how deeply he misunderstood what was happening. He told me I was overthinking things, that if I just relaxed, everything would go back to normal. Normal. I looked at him and realized how different that word meant to each of us. For him, normal was comfort without accountability. For me, normal had become a life where I didn't have to shrink to maintain peace. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I simply let the comment hang between us, unchallenged and unabsorbed. Internally, something had shifted completely. I no longer felt responsible for how he experienced the consequences of his choices. That responsibility had weighed on me for years. Disguised as loyalty, letting it go felt like setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I was carrying. The preparation phase wasn't dramatic. There were no secret meetings in dark offices, no whispered phone calls. It was paperwork, quiet conversations, careful consideration. It was choosing not to explain myself to people who didn't need explanations. It was choosing myself without announcing it. I noticed the change in how I held my body. Shoulders back. Breath steady. I slept better, even as uncertainty loomed. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from alignment, from knowing your actions match your values, even when the outcome is unknown. By the time Daniel sensed something irreversible was underway, it was already too late to stop it. He tried to regain control with charm, then with frustration. He accused me of being cold, of planning something behind his back. In a way, he was right. I was planning, not against him. But for myself, the difference mattered. One afternoon, as I organized a folder I hoped I'd never need, I felt a brief surge of sadness, not for what I was losing, but for how long it had taken me to value my own stability as much as his. The feeling passed quickly, replaced by resolve. Preparation is invisible until it's complete. People mistake quiet for hesitation. They don't realize it's often the final stage before action. I knew then that the next chapter wouldn't be about intention. It would be about outcomes. And I was ready to face them without flinching. Endings rarely arrive with a single, dramatic moment. They arrive in increments, through documents signed, accounts separated, conversations reduced to formalities. By the time anything felt final, most of the real work had already been done quietly, without an audience. The separation didn't begin with raised voices or slammed doors. It began with boundaries. Communication between Daniel and me narrowed quickly. Messages became brief and necessary. Tone mattered more than content. There were no late-night discussions. No attempts to revisit the past. Whatever we had once been to each other no longer applied. That shift alone changed everything. When the legal process moved forward, it felt oddly anticlimactic. There was no sense of victory. Only order being restored. Facts were laid out. Timelines mattered. Documentation spoke more clearly than emotion ever could. Decisions that had once been abstract became concrete. What remained mine did so for a reason. The house. The savings I had contributed to consistently. Certain protections I had put in place before anyone realized they were needed. None of it was taken. None of it was stolen. I walked away with what was already mine. Legally and ethically. Even if Daniel had never expected me to claim it. He struggled with that. I saw it in the way he reacted when outcomes were explained to him. When assumptions he'd relied on unraveled in front of professionals who didn't respond to charm or frustration. He wanted exceptions. Sympathy. Flexibility. He didn't receive them. For the first time. His confidence didn't carry weight. The social reckoning was quieter but unmistakable. Friends adjusted their language around me, careful not to imply blame or curiosity. Some reached out with gentle support. Others said nothing at all, which told me enough. I didn't need apologies or public acknowledgments. Being believed without explanation was enough. Daniel tried once more to pull me back into the narrative. He asked if we could talk. Really talk. The way we used to. He framed it as closure, as maturity. I agreed to meet in a neutral place, not out of hope, but out of completeness. I wanted to be certain there was nothing left unresolved inside me. The conversation lasted less than an hour. He spoke first, moving between regret and defensiveness, careful to avoid admitting too much. He talked about pressure, about mistakes, about how things had spiraled. At one point, he suggested we had both contributed equally to the breakdown. That silence and distance had existed on both sides. I listened without interruption. When he finished, he waited. Clearly expecting reassurance or shared responsibility, I told him, calmly, that I wasn't interested in rewriting the past to make it easier to carry. I said I accepted my part in staying too long, but I wouldn't accept blame for choices I hadn't made. The look on his face told me he understood this time. He asked what I wanted now. I told him I wanted peace. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Peace. The word seemed to confuse him. It didn't offer leverage or a role for him to play. It required nothing from him, which made it impossible to negotiate. We stood up, exchanged a polite goodbye, and walked in opposite directions. I didn't look back. The internal payoff came quietly. Later that evening, when I realized how light I felt. Not euphoric. Light. As if a low-level tension I had lived with for years had finally released. I wasn't waiting for his reaction anymore. I wasn't bracing for the next conversation or misstep. I was finished managing him. There was a moment, a small one, that sealed it for me. I threw away an old notebook where I had once written reminders to myself. Things to say. Things not to forget. Ways to phrase concerns carefully. I flipped through the pages before letting it go, surprised by how much space I had given to maintaining something that never truly held me. Letting it fall into the trash felt symbolic in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't feel anger toward Daniel. I didn't wish him harm. What I felt was distance. Clean and complete, the kind that allows you to step fully into your own life without glancing backward. Walking away required more strength than staying ever had. Staying had been familiar. Walking away demanded clarity, patience, and the willingness to be misunderstood for a while. But it also gave me something staying never could. It gave me myself. By the time the last formalities were resolved, there was nothing left to divide emotionally. The logistics caught up to what I had already accepted internally. The marriage ended on paper long after it had ended in practice. I hadn't taken anything that wasn't mine. I had simply stopped giving away pieces of myself in the hope that restraint would be rewarded. As I closed that chapter, I knew one thing with certainty. What came next wouldn't be about survival or proving anything to anyone. It would be about living without negotiating my worth. And that, more than any outcome, felt like walking away with everything that mattered. Peace didn't arrive all at once. At first, it came in small, almost unremarkable moments. Waking up without tension in my chest. Making coffee without wondering what mood I needed to prepare for. Sitting in silence and realizing it no longer felt heavy or unfinished. After the paperwork was done and the house was quiet again, I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief. Maybe triumph. Instead, what I felt was stillness. The kind that makes you uncomfortable if you're not used to it. For a while, I didn't know what to do with all the space where anxiety used to live. I rebuilt my days slowly, without announcing anything to anyone. I focused on my work, not as a distraction, but as something that belonged to me again. I took longer walks in the evenings. I signed up for a class I'd postponed for years because it felt impractical. There was no reinvention montage, no bold declarations about new beginnings. Just consistency, just choice. What surprised me most was how private healing turned out to be. No one applauds when you finally stop accepting less than you deserve. There's no ceremony for reclaiming your own voice. The world keeps moving at the same pace, and you have to learn how to move with it differently. A few months later, I saw Daniel by chance. It was a brief moment, the kind that would have once ruined my entire day. I was walking through a small market on a Saturday morning, distracted by my phone, when I noticed him ahead of me. He was with someone else. Younger, animated. He looked like a man trying hard to appear unbothered. For a split second, I wondered how I would feel. The answer came immediately. Nothing. My body didn't tense. My thoughts didn't race. I didn't slow down or speed up. I simply walked past, aware of him without being pulled toward him. He noticed me at the last moment, his expression flickering with surprise. Maybe regret. I didn't stop. That was when I understood what freedom actually feels like. Not anger, not indifference performed for effect, just absence. The absence of attachment, expectation, and emotional labor. Later that night, I thought about how many years I had spent believing that letting go would hurt more than holding on. I had been wrong. Holding on had cost me far more than I ever realized. Revenge had never been my goal, even when the story might look that way from the outside. Revenge keeps you tied to the person who hurt you. It requires attention, energy, and a continued relationship with the past. Peace doesn't ask for any of that. Peace is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand witnesses. It simply shows up one day and stays, as long as you don't chase chaos out of habit. I learned that walking away doesn't mean you lost. It means you stopped negotiating your worth with someone who never planned to meet you halfway. It means you chose clarity over comfort. Even when comfort seemed easier in the moment, I didn't destroy his life. I simply stopped saving it. And in doing so, I saved my own. If you're listening to this and something about it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. Silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen, not endured. There's a difference between patience and erasure, between peacekeeping and self-abandonment. You don't need a dramatic ending to justify leaving a situation that slowly makes you smaller. Sometimes the line is crossed quietly, at a dinner table, in a tone no one challenges. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up without explaining yourself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment when something small made everything suddenly clear? You're not alone, and your experience matters more than you might think. Feel free to share in the comments. And if you want to hear more true stories about boundaries, dignity, and choosing peace over revenge, stay with the channel and subscribe. There are more conversations like this waiting, and you're always welcome here.